Hello, and welcome to the substitute lecture for the one that Zoom failed to record Monday night, the 8th lecture on Locke. So there are basically two things that I want to talk about today. The first one is, according to Locke, how our knowledge can be extended. And the second one is knowledge of existence. So I'm going to talk about this one first. But before I get into details of this, there's one other thing that I have to mention, which is the distinction that Locke makes between knowledge and judgment. Because this is important to understand what Locke means by knowledge, and therefore what he means by how our knowledge can be extended, and why we should care about how far our knowledge can be extended. So the first thing to point out right away about Locke's definition of the term knowledge is that knowledge involves certainty. Right? So according to Locke, it's not enough for something to count as knowledge if I assent to a proposition. So remember, assenting to a proposition means taking two ideas to agree or disagree with each other. And again, it's not enough, according to Locke, it's obviously not enough that I simply assent to the proposition for it to count as knowledge, because I could be wrong, right? So I can, think that all triangles are red, but they're actually blue triangles, so those ideas don't agree in the way I take them to. But it's not enough even for me to take the ideas to agree and to be right. So it's not enough for the proposition I assent to be true. So what else do you need to make it knowledge? And according to Locke, what you need is certainty. So this is a pretty strict requirement. It means that, according to Locke, a lot of the things, probably most of the things that we usually say we know, we shouldn't strictly say we know, because we don't have certainty about them. So, for example, if I say, I know that there's a place called China and lots of people live there, right? Normally we wouldn't hesitate to say that we know that, but Locke is going to say, well, if you're not currently sensing the place called China and all the people who live there, you don't know it. It's only a matter of probability. It may be a very high probability, but even if you have seen it in the past, I've never seen China, but suppose I had seen China, even if I had seen China in the past, I couldn't be sure it was still there. Other things might have happened in between. So although I have good reason to believe, Locke will agree, that China is there and that there are lots of people in it, that doesn't amount to what he calls knowledge. So since that, and I guess that shouldn't be surprising, because as we saw last time, Locke actually does think that we don't know very much. So, but what about all that other stuff that we usually say we know? So Locke doesn't throw that out. He just says that we shouldn't call it knowledge. We should call it judgment. This isn't a very standard use of the term judgment in philosophy. I don't know that Locke made it up. I'm not sure where he got it from, but anyway, this is the way Locke uses the term. Judgment is the faculty, that is the ability that we have to take ideas to agree and disagree. It is to agree or disagree, even without certainty, even without being certain that they agree or disagree. And this is the definition. This is book 4, chapter 14 of judgment. And the definition is in section 3. This is on page 576. The faculty which God has given man to supply the want of clear and certain knowledge in cases where that cannot be had is judgment, whereby the mind takes its ideas to agree or disagree, or, which is the same, any proposition to be true or false, without perceiving a demonstrative evidence in the proofs. And when he says without perceiving a demonstrative evidence, maybe this is a little bit too far away. When he says without perceiving a demonstrative evidence, he means without perceiving even a demonstrative evidence. Remember, there's something better than demonstrative evidence, according to Locke, namely intuitive evidence, where we don't need a demonstration. So the point is, we don't have intuitive or even demonstrative evidence, and yet we can still take our ideas to agree and disagree. It's going to be a problem. So this is basically, like I said, judgment isn't maybe the most common name for it. The most common name for it is opinion. We take something to be true or false, but we don't know that it's true or false. And in fact, Locke often calls this opinion also, rather than his official name for it, which is judgment. Now you might think, based on what I talked about at the end last time, that this opinion, that is taking ideas to agree or disagree without having demonstrative or intuitive evidence that they agree or disagree, would fall under what Locke calls association of ideas, or what he also calls madness. Right? That this would always be opposed to reason and therefore would count, according to Locke, as madness. But of course, Locke doesn't want to say that, right? But that when I say there's a place called China and there are a lot of people there, or even when I say there's another room in the back of my house, I'm not seeing it right now, but it's still there, right? That those are examples of madness. So why not? Well, because remember, the definition of madness is that, or association of ideas in that bad sense, is that the mind joins ideas together, but not according to the order of reason. But according to Locke, reason has an order both for combining ideas with certainty and for combining ideas with less than certainty, that is, with mere probability. So This is Book 4, Chapter 17, Section 2. What need is there of reason? Very much, both for the enlargement of our knowledge and regulating our assent. Right? These are the two things. Enlarging our knowledge, that is, finding that we can join certain ideas with certainty, and regulating our assent, that is, finding that we can join certain ideas with less than certainty. For it hath to do both in knowledge and opinion, and is necessary. Okay, that part's not relevant. So, it's madness means not following the order of reason, the natural order of ideas, either the natural order of ideas in demonstration, where at each step there's intuitive certainty that the two ideas go together, or following the natural order of ideas in arguments of probability, where at each step we can see that the ideas probably go together. So both of those are important uses of reason, and moreover, the second one, the use of reason in forming opinion or judgment, is probably the more common one, right? Most of the things that we quote unquote know are things that, according to Locke, fall into this category of judgment. Nevertheless, Locke is much more interested in knowledge and in how we can enlarge our knowledge than he is in judgment or opinion and how we can regulate that. Why is that? Well, presumably it's because among the narrow areas where we can enlarge our knowledge through demonstration, one of them is geometry. And although Locke doesn't, I don't know if he says this clearly anywhere, I also pointed out last time that another one seems to be theoretical physics, in the sense of we can enlarge our knowledge by propositions about what solid extended things can do to each other by moving. Another area is, according to Locke, is ethics, right? That is, according to Locke, or morality, those are, again, mean the same thing. So according to Locke, morality is susceptible of demonstration just as much as geometry, if only we would use our terms as carefully and pay as much attention in that case as in the other. So we can enlarge our knowledge to include knowledge of what is morally good and evil. And he means that in the main case of what is morally good and evil, that is, what is morally good and evil relative to divine law or the law of reason. Right, obviously we can't have demonstrative certainty about what is the law of opinion or the civil law. That's not what he's talking about there. So if it's the case that we can have demonstrative certainty, that is, knowledge about what is morally good and evil, that's the most important thing we could possibly know, according to Locke, because that's what considerations of what is morally good and evil, that is, of what God will reward or punish, always outweigh any other considerations in determining what pleasure or pain we will get from doing a certain thing. And that's always what we most need. That's the one thing we need to know in order to decide whether to do it or not. So knowledge is, although it's narrow, it contains the most important thing in it, and that's, I think, why Locke is most interested in it. Okay, so going back to this question then, how can our knowledge be extended? Oops, it's off the screen. how can our knowledge be extended? Um, there's basically three ways, according to Locke, but then we'll see that the three ways kind of amount to just two or maybe even just one, depending on how you count. So the first way is reason, and the second way is instruction, and the third way is faith. So I'm going to talk about reason first, and then instruction, and then faith. So how can we improve our knowledge by reason? Um, oops. So the obvious way to do this is by what Locke calls demonstration. And so remember what demonstration amounts to according to Locke. Um, we tend to think of demonstration as proceeding from one proposition, what Locke calls proposition, to another. So, for example, it starts with some kind of axiom, um, like the whole is greater than the part, or parallel lines never meet, or, well, that's the definition of parallel. But anyway, the parallel postulates. It starts with some axiom like that, maybe another axiom or two, and then we draw consequences from that, which are also propositions, things that can be either true or false. And in the end, we arrive at a proposition, which is the conclusion. But remember, Locke thinks that these universal maxims or axioms are actually not very useful for most purposes. And he doesn't think that that's how mathematical demonstrations, for example, proceed. Rather, the conclusion is about the agreement or disagreement of two ideas. So this idea is going to be the subject of the conclusion, and this one's going to be the predicate of the conclusion, let's say. So if the demonstration is that the interior angles of a triangle are equal to two right angles, this is going to be the idea of the interior angles of a triangle. And this is going to be the idea of two right angles. And the conclusion is that this idea agrees with this one according to the second mode of agreement and disagreement, the mode of what Locke calls relation, or in other words, similarity, in this case, equality. Right? So we're not going to show that they're the same idea. They're not the same idea. The three angles of a triangle can't be two right angles. There have to be three of them, and only one of them could be a right angle, right? So, but we're going to show that they have this relation of equality between them, these two ideas. And the way we do it is by finding some other ideas that go in between. Right, and remember, I explained in detail how I think this is supposed to work in this case last time. Here's the three angles of the triangle, and here are the two right angles. And we draw these lines here. We draw, well, kind of starting backwards. I should have drawn the lines first. It's not really a right angle, is it? Oh well. Right, we extend the base of the triangle and we draw parallel to the base through the apex of the triangle. And then, so these three angles which are basically parts of three different circles, can't be compared to these two angles, which are two parts of the same circle here, right? That is, we can't draw one circle that all these angles are parts of to see if they amount to the same part of that circle or not. So that's why this isn't and can't be intuitively certain according to Locke, because as he puts it, or he says the three angles of a triangle can never be brought together in such a way as to compare them to the two right angles. But instead, what we do is we find this intermediate idea, which is the intermediate idea of these three angles here. So these three angles, on the one hand, equal the two right angles because they are parts of an exhaustive division of exactly the same part of this same circle. So these three angles, it's intuitively certain that they equal these two right angles. And Locke also apparently thinks it's intuitively certain that this angle equals this angle, the alternating angles, and that this angle equals this angle. Or maybe he thinks something more fundamental is intuitively certain, like, for example, that if this is a right angle, this must also be a right angle. So there's some other principle there other than that the parts of a circle add up to certain wholes. And it's not clear to me, at least, exactly what it is, but it's anyway. I think so. Let's say it's this. So then Locke would say that we can get from this to this in two steps, and they're each intuitively certain. So first we get from the idea of these three angles to the idea of these three angles by the intuitive certainty that this is the same as this and this is the same as this. And then we get from these three angles to these two right angles by the intuitive certainty that this plus this plus this is the same as this. Okay, or well, it is the same as this plus this. All right. So that's the way a demonstration can enlarge our knowledge. We first look at these two ideas and we're not sure if they agree or disagree, but then we find the intermediate idea, and from that we are able to learn that they agree or disagree. And so we enlarge our knowledge by knowing this proposition, which we didn't know before. Locke seems to think that this is the only use for demonstrations. First of all, Locke seems to always think that this is the situation in which we carry out a demonstration. That is, we have two ideas. We don't know if they agree or disagree. And so we look for some intermediate ideas that can lead us from one to the other. So this involves these two faculties that Locke calls sagacity, which is finding intermediate ideas, and elation, which means putting them in the right order. In this case, I guess there's no work for elation to do, but if there were several intermediate ideas, elation would be the faculty of putting them in order. So in other words, he doesn't think that we ever just start out to try to find out what we can demonstrate. We always know what it is we're trying to prove. That part is, I think, pretty realistic as far as mathematics goes, at least, which is the main example we have in mind here. And I guess also with respect to morality, less clear. But anyway, in the case of mathematics, it's always motivated reasoning, so to speak. right? Mathematicians never just start to prove whatever they can from some axioms. They always are trying to prove something, or almost always. There maybe there's a little bit uncertainty about how much they'll be able to prove or whatever, but that's basically a matter of wanting to prove this and also wanting to prove this and not being sure you can get both, or something like that. So that part seems to be kind of realistic. However, the other part, as I was starting to say before, is that Locke seems to think the only reason we do this then is if we don't already know that the ideas agree or disagree, and we want to find out. So it's only used to enlarge our knowledge. At least that's the only use of it that Locke discusses. And when he talks about cases where that use wouldn't apply, he tends to say that in that case a demonstration would be useless, right? And so that part is maybe less realistic, right? At least as far as what mathematicians do with demonstrations. It seems to follow from that once you have a demonstration of something, there would never be any interest in finding another demonstration of it. Maybe, Locke doesn't mention this, maybe there would be interest in finding a shorter demonstration. Again, a demonstration can't be shorter than this, but if you imagine there were more steps in here, you could find one with fewer steps and that would be easier to remember or something like that. Locke doesn't discuss that. But in any case, mathematicians, when they look for a new proof of a theorem that already exists, they're not just looking for a shorter proof that'll be easier to remember. They're looking for a more elegant proof, a more perspicuous proof, a proof that somehow shows better the connection between, well, as Locke would say, the nature of the connection between these two ideas, the reason for the connection between these two ideas, right? According to Locke, we don't use demonstration to do any of those. Well, he doesn't deny it, he doesn't consider that we might use demonstration to do any of those things. So that probably shows that he doesn't have it's possible that mathematics has changed since Locke, between Locke and now, I'm not sure. But anyway, he shows that he doesn't have a very clear understanding of what we call mathematics. But I think even more so, it may be a problem in some of the things he says about mathematical or symbolic logic. Right, he criticizes, I didn't assign this as part of the reading, or almost none of it, but he criticizes at length the traditional Aristotelian form of symbolic logic, the logic of syllogisms. And basically the main point of his criticism is that the art of syllogisms is not useful for enlarging our knowledge, and therefore it's not useful. But Aristotelian symbolic logic, like modern symbolic logic, was not mostly aimed, I think, at getting better at convincing yourself or others that something was true that you didn't already know, right? It's not like after you take Phil 9, you become better at enlarging your knowledge or enlarging other people's knowledge, because now you can write all these little things like, upside down A and whatever, and put all your proofs in that form, and that will make them much more convincing. Rather, I think, both Aristotelian logic and modern symbolic logic are mostly aimed at trying to understand what proofs are, like what different kinds of them there are, what the nature of demonstration is, how far it could possibly take us, things like that. And again, Locke doesn't see the use for a discussion of demonstrations for those purposes. Okay, so anyway, that's demonstration as far as it goes, but also you should notice one other thing here. If demonstration can be used to enlarge our knowledge. That means there's also something else that can be used to enlarge our knowledge, namely intuition, right? That is, demonstration works by at every step appealing to intuition, according to Locke. And again, what Locke calls intuition is the immediate perception that two ideas agree or disagree with each other. You might say, well, wait, I mean, if you can see that immediately, then that's not a way of enlarging your knowledge. That means you already knew it. But this is important. That's not what Locke thinks in such a case, right? Remember back in book 1, part of the attack on the view that we have innate principles was that if we had innate principles, that would mean there are certain things that we always know, which would mean not that we could perceive them to be true with certainty, because Locke says everything we ever will know and plenty of things we never will know, that is, everything pair of ideas we ever will perceive the connection between with certainty, those are all things that we could know with certainty, right? So if there are innate principles or characters stamped upon the mind, that would mean we always go around perceiving that agreement or disagreement from the instant we're born. So the very fact that we find things out that we weren't already thinking that they were true when we were born, according to Locke, shows that we don't have innate principles. And that means at the time that we do find them out, according to Locke, we're enlarging our knowledge, right? So an infant at the time that it's born doesn't know that these 3 angles are equal to these 2 angles, because an infant at the time that it's born doesn't even have the idea of angle or equality or all those other abstract ideas that are involved in that proposition, according to Locke. So when we do get those ideas, that's still not enough, according to Locke, right? We could have learned what an angle is and what equality is, but still not know this because we've never compared them to each other. We've never compared these ideas to each other in exactly this way. And at the moment we do compare them, we'll instantly see that they agree, but that enlarges our knowledge, right? So actually enlarging our knowledge by reason includes enlarging it by demonstration and enlarging it by intuition. And instruction, right? So as I said, when I gave my list originally, reason, instruction, and faith, so the main question is going to be whether this introduces anything new at all beyond reason and instruction. But already here, it's going to be not entirely clear that instruction is a different way of enlarging your knowledge than reason. So why is that? Well, basically, it works by exactly the same things that enlarging your knowledge by reason does, according to Locke, namely demonstration and intuition. So if we look on book 4, chapter 8, section 3, this is on page 540. Instruction lies in something very different, and he that would enlarge his own or another's mind to truths he does not yet know must find out intermediate ideas and then lay them in such order, one by another, that the understanding may see the agreement or disagreement of those in question. Now, um, so demonstration is exactly the same uh, process, whether I'm enlarging my own ideas or the ideas of someone else. To enlarge my own ideas by demonstration, I take the proposition that I want to prove. That is, I take these two ideas and I look for and try to put into order the intermediate ideas that will go from one to another. To instruct someone else, um, I convey to them this chain of intermediate ideas and get them to follow it in the right order to see that this agrees or disagrees with that. Um, and in order to do that, as we already saw when we talked about um, uh, the use of language to extend knowledge versus other uses of language, that is rhetoric, or all the parts of rhetoric except clarity and order. Um, the way I do that is by arranging my words that signify ideas in the natural order of reason, and doing it in such a clear way that I get you to entertain all the same ideas I did in that same natural order of reason. And then you will automatically see that this conclusion is true. So, um, of course, this depends on a couple of things. Number one, it depends on us both having the same ideas. And in some sense, Locke thinks, as we know, that that's an absolute limit on what I can instruct someone else about, right? So I can't prove something about colors to a blind person, according to Locke, because they don't have the ideas of color. Um, that really only applies to simple ideas, however. If we're talking about complex ideas, I can possibly get you to have complex ideas that you don't already have by telling you the definition. So that is going to be part of the legitimate arts of rhetoric, clarity and order. I guess it falls under clarity, right? To make sure that, at least as far as the complex ideas go, that you have all the ones that I have in your mind to begin with. I mean, I can give you a simple idea if your senses are in order by showing you something, and thereby, you know, that thing, not me, right? But the thing I'm showing you will cause you to perceive a certain simple idea if your sense organs are in order. Um, I'm not sure if Locke counts that as part of instruction in this sense or not. Like, is that kind of a way for me to enlarge your knowledge, but it's not really me that's doing it. It's the thing I'm showing you. In any case, so that's how instruction is going to work. And and as I said, there's a couple of things this assumes. The other thing it assumes is that whenever I can be intuitively certain of some agreement or disagreement between ideas, you also can be intuitively certain. And in fact, you also will be intuitively certain if I can get you to compare the two ideas. So that is, Locke is assuming that among human beings, at least, um, none of us has like a greater range of intuitive certainty than others, right? Like, it couldn't be that, for example, I can be intuitively certain that these three angles add up to these two angles, but you can't. You need the intermediate idea. Because if that were true, then I might be able to arrange the ideas fine for my own purposes, but I couldn't use my demonstration to enlarge your knowledge because some of the steps for you would be too big. So Locke is now it's a little bit strange that he assumes that, because in several places he talks about the possibility that superhuman intelligences, other finite spirits, that is what he calls angels, um, uh, perhaps have purely intuitive knowledge. This is a traditional doctrine about angels, actually, right? Like if you look in Thomas Aquinas, you see that, he shows that angelic angels don't need demonstrations. They know everything intuitively in this sense. Um, uh, or at least have much more intuitive knowledge than we do. Don't need such long demonstrations because many things that for us require a lot of steps are intuitive for them. And he even suggests that in the afterlife, maybe we too will have an enlarged range of intuitive knowledge. So that seems like, how can I be sure then that the finite spirit I'm talking to right now, if there is one, how can I be sure that the finite spirit I'm talking to right now doesn't uh, also have a different range of intuitive knowledge than I do? It's possible he thinks that a different range of intuitive knowledge would require a completely different way of seeing things, like a completely different set of simple ideas or something like that, so that it wouldn't be, and because the limits of our intuitive knowledge are somehow like contained in the nature of the kinds of ideas we need to use to represent things, right? Like what I was saying about that what we can know intuitively is certain necessary relations between the parts of the same whole, for example, and that these three angles are not parts of the same whole. So no being that perceived this triangle the way we do would ever be able to know this conclusion intuitively. Then you would have to work out a lot of things about that. It might end up taking him close, even closer, I would say, than he already is to Kant. That there would be something about the form of our external intuition involved in the limits of what we can know intuitively here. But in any case, that's all just kind of speculation. But I want to add one more thing, which is that so in that quote I read to you, Locke seems to say that I can enlarge my knowledge or someone else's knowledge only by demonstration. Of course, we know that's, as I already argued, that's not true in the case of my own knowledge. I can enlarge it by intuition and demonstration. And again, if we look back to book one, we'll see that that's true for instructing someone else as well. So if you look on page 69, this is back in book one. Book one, chapter 2, at least in this way of ordering the chapters, section 20 of numbering the chapters of book one. Book one, chapter 2, section 21 on page 69. So here he's talking, as he is in that whole book, about whether we have intuitive principles. But the question here is, if we have intuitive principles, how can it be that someone can teach me that a principle is true? Right, and he's dealing here with maybe I shouldn't put this up. It's going to distract me. He's dealing here with the claim that the sense in which we have innate principles is that we assent to them as soon as they're proposed to us, right? So as soon as someone tells me the parts are equal to the whole, or one part that is a part is less than the whole, as soon as someone proposes that to me, I assent to it. And Locke says, sure enough, I agree these principles are self-evident, right? If I have those ideas and someone gets me to compare them to each other, again, I'll see immediately that they agree or disagree. So I agree that these principles are self-evident, but that doesn't show that they're innate. On the contrary, this shows that they're not innate, because when do I assent to them? When they're proposed to me, right? And he says, um, what need they be proposed in order to gaining assent, when, being in the understanding by a natural and original impression, if there were any such, they could not but be known before? Or doth the proposing them print them clearer in the mind than nature did? If so, then the consequence will be that a man knows them better after he has been thus taught them than he did before. Whence it will follow that these principles may be made more evident to us by others' teaching than nature hath made them by impression. Right? So this goes to show, in this place, the reason Locke is saying this is to show that since I can be taught these things, obviously they're not innate. Um, because, again, if they were innate, that would have to mean that I know them, that I constantly recognize them, assent to them from the instant I'm born on. And that's not the case. I didn't assent to them until someone proposed them to me. But we can gather for our place that Locke counts this as a case of teaching, right? If someone tells me the whole is less than the part, and because they told me that, I put those ideas together and now assent to that proposition for the first time, that counts as them having taught me. So, so instruction of others or teaching proceeds also not just by demonstration, but also by intuition. We only question whether we should count this as a separate way of enlarging my knowledge or not is that, again, what the enlargement by instruction actually does is just to get me to produce the proof, the demonstration or the intuitive proof inside myself the way someone else already had it. Right? So there's a difference here. The difference is that the first person to come up with the proof, who didn't get it by instruction, but rather, so to speak, directly by reason, needed those faculties of sagacity and elation to do it. They had to, for the first time, find the chain of intermediate ideas that will lead from the subject to the predicate. After that, everyone who learns it by instruction doesn't need those faculties. They just get it from their teacher, and then they pass it on to whoever they teach. But what each person does as they convince themselves in the chain, what each person does as they convince themselves is the truth is the same thing the first person ended up doing after they had found that chain of ideas to begin with. So do those count as two different ways or the same way? I don't know. It depends how you count. All right. Anyway, so that does it for reason and instruction. What about faith? Okay, so this is more interesting. How can we enlarge our knowledge by faith, according to Locke? Or can we? What is faith according to Locke? Or at least, how does he use it in this context? So this is the definition. This is from Book 4, Chapter 18, Section 2. Faith, on the other side, is the assent to any proposition, not thus made out by the deductions of reason, and again we should say by deduction or intuition of reason, but upon the credit of the proposer as coming from God in some extraordinary way of communication. This way of discovering truths to men we call revelation, right? So faith means that I assent to some proposition, that is, I take some ideas to agree or disagree, not because I have a demonstration or intuitive proof that they go together. But because someone tells me, God told me they go together. And he adds, by an extraordinary way of communication, right? Because I think, according to Locke, there is an ordinary way that God tells you things that things are true, but the ordinary way is reason, right? So God is responsible for your reason working the way it does. So every time you use it, God is telling you in an ordinary way that something is true. That doesn't count as faith. Faith is when someone tells me, God told me in an extraordinary way that this is true. And that extraordinary way we call revelation. Right? So he doesn't go into detail about what that extraordinary way is, but you can imagine that they heard a voice, they saw a miracle, and they heard a voice that came to them in a dream. It's something like that. And then they tell me, okay, God says that these two ideas agree with each other. Now, by the way, so I think this definition of faith, the part about God is really narrows it down to a special case of faith. You might call it theological faith. But I think what Locke is saying here is that that sense of faith is just a special case of the broader sense of faith where it just means trust. Right? So anytime I join two ideas to each other because someone tells me that they're joined to each other, I'm trusting them or having faith in them. And the faith in this religious sense, according to Locke, is just that same thing, only in this case, the person who said that they agree or disagree is God. Well, it sort of is God, but actually it's a little bit tricky. So Locke talks about two different kinds of revelation. And it's only apparently the second kind of revelation that's involved in faith. Anyway, it's the only kind that's involved in this definition of faith that I just read you. So the first kind of revelation, which, look at this again, I believe he calls it immediate revelation. So here's God. And here's the prophet. And the first kind of revelation is when God told the prophet that these two ideas agree with each other, or however that worked, by this extraordinary means. But that's not what we're talking about in that definition. Remember, we said it was we believe it, we assent to it upon the credit of the proposer as coming from God in some extraordinary way of communication. So here the situation is, here's me. I'm assenting to this proposition because the prophet tells me that God told them. So there's two steps, or rather there's at least two steps, right? Of course, usually there's many more steps than that, right? As Locke points out, I didn't see Moses write the Bible. If he did write the Bible, I didn't see Moses write the Bible. So if I say I believe something it says in the Bible because Moses said God told him, how do I know Moses said it? Well, someone told someone else, and they told someone else, and they told someone else, blah, 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 and someone told me. That's the best I'm going to get, right? So there could be a lot of steps in between here, but this is, so to speak, the fundamental situation, and this is what Locke mostly focuses on, right? So someone tells me that God told them something, and I'm going to believe that it's true because, so there's actually two things I have to, well, maybe more than two things I have to believe here, but three things I have to believe here, let's say. I have to believe that the prophet heard it from God. I have to believe, Okay, scratch that. There's two different people I have to believe here. I have to believe the prophet that God told them. And then, assuming God did tell them, I have to believe God. So the first thing I think Locke thinks I can, I mean, well, it was the second thing, but it's the first thing in terms of what happened first, right? That is, believing God, Locke thinks, is not a problem. I can have, I believe he thinks I can have demonstrative certainty that God wouldn't lie to someone. I mean, he doesn't make that argument. There's an argument to this effect, famous argument to this effect in the Meditations, right? That God is not a deceiver. Which is not clear exactly how it's supposed to work, but anyway, Locke probably has some argument like that in mind. So he probably thinks it's demonstrative certainty that if God really tells you that two ideas agree with each other, then they agree with each other. But the question is, should I believe the prophet that the source of this was God? Well, how am I going to decide whether to believe that? Actually, maybe I should stop here and say a little bit more about the first thing I just said. How do I know I should believe this if God told me? So I just said it's not a problem. We have a demonstrative argument. But that means that, in a sense, suppose I was in this situation, I was the prophet, and I was sure that God told me this, and I was sure that I understood what God meant. So actually, those two things, as Locke is going to point out, are also a problem. But forget that problem for a second. So suppose I know that God told me something. Now I need to decide whether to assent to it or not. How do I decide? Well, so I still have these two ideas, and I need to put something in between them. So I put in it's a little bit hard to know how to draw this, but I put in, first of all, the idea that God said that they agreed with each other. I mean, that's a proposition, not an idea. This is the first time I tried to draw this, and I just realized in trying to draw it that maybe Locke doesn't have a good way to talk about it, actually. But so in any case, somehow I'm going to build a bridge between these two ideas using the fact that God said they agree with each other. But that's just another idea or another proposition. That is another two ideas or something. I mean, I guess maybe one of them is the idea of agreement between these two ideas, and the other is the idea of God telling me something. Um, so, right, so maybe that's kind of how to draw it according to Locke. This is the idea of God, and this is the idea of agreement between these two ideas. But these two still don't have an intuitive connection to this idea on the one hand or this idea on the other hand. How am I going to get that intuitive connection? And the answer is, well, I had a demonstrative proof that if God says two ideas agree, they actually do agree. So therefore, I have a way from going from these two ideas to, and this is where I guess it's still hard to see how Locke can draw it, but I have a way of going from these two ideas to the connection between these two ideas. So I can start with this idea ask, how do I get to this one? Bring in this proposition that God said they agree, and use that to build the bridge between them. So all of that is my reason. This, although again, the drawing of it is a little bit weird, and maybe that shows a problem for Locke, this is a demonstration that these ideas agree with each other. So really, here, what we've used to enlarge our knowledge is just reason. There isn't another way of enlarging our knowledge besides reason. Okay, but what about this step? Well, this is what Locke says about it. So this is book 4, chapter 18, section 5, on page 610. Oh no, section 6 on page, is what I wanted to read, on page 611. I do not say how those who make revelation alone the sole object of faith can say that it is a matter of faith and not of reason to believe that such or such a proposition to be found in such or such a book is of divine inspiration, unless it be revealed that that proposition or all in that book was communicated by divine inspiration. So, okay, I mean, if we look back at this case, so if we ask, how do I know that the prophet actually has heard this from God? You might say, well, I know that through faith. So not only do I know this proposition through faith, but I know the other thing I need to believe to get there, namely that this proposition was communicated by God in an extraordinary way. I know that by faith too. So Locke says, well, how is that going to work? Well, or at least, I mean, I say I know it by revelation. So if that means I know it by traditional revelation, then we just get another picture like this, where there's another prophet, or maybe the same prophet, although that would be even worse, I guess. Another prophet comes to tell me that this prophet is telling the truth. Now, obviously, that's going to be an infinite regress, right? We're always going to need another prophet. We're going to need infinitely many prophets. So that's no good. So it would have to be by an immediate revelation, right? So the only way revelation could be useful here would be that I'm also a prophet. Only the content of my prophecy is that I should believe this prophet. Now, that seems kind of superfluous and also not what people usually claim about. I mean, it would mean that there's no such thing really as traditional revelation. There's only immediate revelation. Everyone's a prophet. Not what people usually claim about this. So, I mean, if you did claim it, that would be nice for you, but it wouldn't give me any reason to believe it unless I also got a revelation, right? So, so that can't be the solution. So how is it then, that I'm supposed to know this. Without such a revelation, the believing or not believing that proposition or book to be of a divine authority can never be a matter of faith, but matter of reason, and such as I must come to an assent to only by the use of my reason. Right? So the answer is, well, um, uh, this to know that this prophet is telling the truth, that is telling me truly that God communicated this to them. Um, that's enlarging my knowledge. What are the ways of enlarging my knowledge? Well, we just ruled out faith. I mean, certainly ruled out faith in the strict sense, meaning that it would be by traditional revelation, right? Because that would lead to an infinite regress. So, uh, but we ruled out revelation in general as a way of doing this. So, what ways are left? Well, reason and instruction. But as I just pointed out, instruction also ultimately appeals to my own reason, perhaps not to my sagacity and elation, but to my ability to recognize that the demonstration is valid. So, the only way that I'm going to be able to learn something like that this person is a true prophet is by using my own reason. And that's why I said that when you look at this list, reason, instruction, faith, although Locke talks as if this were another way, maybe we can enlarge our knowledge beyond the deductions of reason, the truth is that this way of enlarging our knowledge really just uses reason, right? Because it's up to my reason to determine whether this person is a true prophet. And then, having determined with my reason that this person is a true prophet, I supply a demonstration that the proposition they're communicating is true, because God is not a deceiver. So the whole thing from beginning to end is a use of reason. So there isn't really a use of reason in opposition to faith, according to Locke. Now you might say, if that's true, according to Locke, why does he talk as if there is? Well, this is an area maybe where he doesn't necessarily want everyone to notice that he's really saying that there is no opposition between faith and reason, that faith is just a special case of reason. He doesn't want people to notice that so much that they get upset with him for saying that. On the other hand, however, he does want to notice them enough that they'll stop allowing people to come and try to convince them against their reason that they should believe certain things due to faith. Right. And I mean, as usual, at some point he brings out the example of the Eucharist, right? One of the things that we can never be brought to believe by traditional revelation is the same body can be in two places at once. But probably what he has in mind more importantly are those demonstrative truths of morality that he thinks there are, right? That is, if someone comes along and says, God told me that you should kill people and take all their stuff, Locke wants me to be able to say, well, hold on a second, that's contrary to reason, so it can't be true. Right? Reason can't go against itself, so there couldn't possibly be a proof that this person is a prophet if what they said God told them is something that is absurd according to reason. That is, for example, if they told me to violate the divine law, which, as remember, I said Locke elsewhere calls the law of reason, right? The reason revelation can't tell me to violate the law of reason because revelation itself is dependent on reason for its authority. Um, and by the way, even in the case of the prophets, um, Locke says that what God tells you goes against your reason, in that case, even the prophet themselves can't believe it. And again, you can see why here, because, well, actually, I mean, even the prophet themselves has to not believe it. They have to not believe it because, again, they can't be brought by anything to believe something that's contrary to their reason. So if God tells me, go kill everyone and take all their stuff, um, uh, I can't believe that that's a correct instruction, meaning that God informs me that that's morally good for me to do that. I can't believe that that's a correct instruction. So wait, doesn't that mean there's a contradiction because I can also prove to myself that God doesn't lie? Well, Locke says, hold on a second. How sure are you that that was really God telling you that, right? And then we can see that according to Locke's own criteria, the answer is always going to be never completely sure, right? Because at most, what I'm sure of is that I saw or heard or otherwise sensed various things. But that those things were caused by God. So that concerns the kind of knowledge. Remember that Locke, the kind of knowledge that Locke calls sensible, right? Which has some weird status as like a third thing in addition to reason and instruction. I guess you could also say about all those things I was saying before, we also enlarge our knowledge by sensing things. Anyway, without going back again into the question, hopefully if I have time, I'll talk about it at the end. It looks like I really don't have time. Why does the substitute lecture take longer than the live lecture? You'd think it would be the opposite. Okay, well, again, as I did last time, I'm just going to go over the time since this is a recorded lecture. If you don't like it, you can just fast forward. Okay, so, but I'm going to try to get to at least everything I got to in the live lecture, because otherwise I think it wouldn't be fair. What was I saying? Sensible knowledge. Da, 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 da. Oh, right. So, the most I can be certain of in a situation where I hear a miraculous voice and I see miraculous things or whatever you want to imagine this extraordinary mode of communication was, at least of the things that Locke uh, allows that might happen to me. Um, it never will amount to more than probability that actually God produced it. It might be a very high probability, but will never be more than that. So when I see a burning bush that isn't consumed, and a voice comes out of it and says, "I am the God of your fathers," blah blah blah, and then says, "Hey, by the way, here's some innocent people who don't deserve to be punished. Go kill them and take all their stuff." I say to myself, "Boy, it really sure seems like God is telling me this, but it couldn't be," according to Locke. It must be something else. It's a hallucination. It's a dream. It's an evil angel. Someone is, or something is causing me to have these ideas, but it's not an extraordinary means of communication from God. But notice what that also means. My certainty here is certainly not going to be higher than the prophet's certainty. actually, for certain, it's going to be lower, right? That is, whatever my reason does to assure me that this person is a true prophet and not a pretender is going to be, it's all going to be based on what I sense about that person. So it's all, this step is also going to be mere probability added to this step, which was mere probability. So conclusion, number one, all I'm using here is my reason. But number two, I'm not using my reason really to enlarge my knowledge at all here in the strict sense. I'm using my reason to gain probable assent, judgment. So that's the most that faith is going to yield, according to Locke. And again, you can probably see why he might not want to broadcast that too loudly here. Hume, in his essay on miracles, which we're not going to read in this course, but which is very interesting and worth reading, basically takes this exact same line of thought and extends it farther and says that if someone tells me, so Hume agrees that there's certain things that could happen to me that would cause me to, would rationally, well, according to Hume, it's not reason here, but anyway, would in the correct and usual way cause me to believe that there has been a miracle, right? If I actually see the waters of the sea parting and I walk through them or whatever, then Hume would say, yeah, that's a case where, yeah, you should, if that really happens to you, you should believe there is a miracle, which he defines as something that goes against the laws of nature. Some problems with that. But anyway, but he says, suppose someone comes and tells you that they saw something like that and therefore there was a miracle. He says you should never believe them. And he tries to prove you should never believe them by showing that no matter how probable, no matter how improbable it is that they're lying or mistaken, it's still more probable that they're lying or mistaken than it is that the laws of nature were violated. So since we're weighing probabilities here, that's what we have to do. If you can really show that, that will mean that every time someone tells you they saw a miracle, you should conclude, no matter how unlikely it seems, that they're either lying or mistaken. Therefore, according to Hume, the content of what Locke is calling traditional revelation is zero, right? There's nothing that I should assent to with any probability because of this. Hume published that posthumously, I believe. All right. Okay, so that's everything I wanted to say about faith. And also, therefore, everything I wanted to say about the first topic here, which is how our knowledge can be extended. Now I want to talk about knowledge of existence. Now, in the live lecture, I didn't get through everything I wanted to say about knowledge of existence, but I got, well, let's see, hold on a second. Yeah, I had, I think, 25 minutes in which I talked about it, whereas right now, according to the usual time of the class, I have about 15 minutes left. But like I said, I'll just go over if I have to. Maybe I'll even go over a little more to cover a couple things I didn't get to in the live lecture. But all right, so anyway, knowledge of existence. And you can see. So first of all, as you may recall, it's not exactly clear what Locke is talking about when he talks about knowledge of existence. Remember, so knowledge in general is about agreement and disagreement of our ideas. And then Locke listed 4 modes of agreement and disagreement of our ideas: identity and difference, relation, necessary coexistence. And then knowledge of existence is apparently corresponds to the 4th mode, which is real existence. It seems like pretty much talking about the same thing here. So when we talk about knowledge of existence, that is knowledge that something exists, we're talking about knowledge that consists in this 4th mode of agreement and disagreement. Problem here is that it seems like this 4th mode is not about agreement and disagreement of ideas at all. Rather, it's about the agreement of ideas and things, right? About real existence, the agreement between the idea and the race or thing. You might think, well, okay, no, it's about agreement between an idea and the idea of existence. And Locke doesn't say that when he talks about this 4th mode, but maybe that's a way we could get around this. Actually, maybe I should say, I don't think I mentioned this in the live lecture, but one way around it would be to say that this is an exception to the rule that all knowledge is about agreement and disagreement of ideas. Now, again, he doesn't say that when he introduces it. In fact, he introduces that list by saying there's 4 ways that ideas can agree and disagree. But maybe you could say this is an exception. And moreover, you could say it's an exception because it's really these first 2 ways of knowing something, first 2 modes of enlarging our knowledge, that are ways of seeing agreement and disagreement of ideas. This is seeing the immediate agreement and disagreement, and this is seeing it immediately by means of intermediate ideas. But this 3rd kind is an exception to that, right? That is when I learn that something is there. And what do I learn is there? Well, what I learned there is some quality. So here's my mind. Here's the operation of perception. At least this is one of the ways Locke uses the term perception. Sense perception. Here's the idea, say the idea of white. And here's the quality of white in some body. Oops. Say a snowball. What is the quality of white? Well, so the operation of perception immediately, its immediate object is this idea of white. Then by means of this idea of white, it refers to this quality of white in the external thing. And what is this quality of white in the external thing? Well, it's the power to cause me to perceive this idea. Right? So the power there is in the snowball of causing me to perceive the idea of white is the whiteness of the snowball. And in this case, since the idea of white is the idea of a secondary quality, it's not a real power in the snowball, it's a bare power. But anyway, never mind that. That's the basic picture here. So what I know of by sensation, sensible knowledge, I think, strictly speaking, is the existence of this power. I have a white idea. I know that there's a power to cause me to perceive the white idea. And because powers can't subsist on their own, I mean, certainly powers that are not real powers can't consist on their own because there is no thing there to call the power. But even real powers, like the primary qualities, um, Locke says, remember when he discusses the idea of power, that we know powers can't subsist on their own. Um, so I'm certain that there's a subject of this power. That is, I have a relative idea of the subject of this power. I don't have a positive or absolute idea of the subject of this power. That is, I have no idea of, I have no clear positive idea of substance. But I do know that there's a subject, in some sense, know that there's a subject in which this power inheres. I don't know that it's a snowball, right? I mean, it could be a hologram machine that's projecting, that's causing me to have this idea of white. This holograms are really not white, but never mind that. It could be some kind of advanced hologram machine. um, uh, so, or maybe some not very advanced. I'm just looking through 3D, goggles at something or whatever. So there's something there that's causing me to have that idea of white, but it's not actually a snowball. That doesn't mean that my sensible knowledge failed. The power was there. Okay, so you might think that this is a mode of enlarging our knowledge that doesn't show the agreement between two ideas. It just shows something about this one idea, namely that the power to create it exists. It's not clear how you, I mean, this would also have to mean that there's an exception to Locke's general view about what propositions are. Because in this case, the thing that I know is not the agreement or disagreement of two ideas, and so on and so forth. And Locke doesn't say any of this. And moreover, Locke discusses 3 and sort of 4 cases of knowledge of existence. One is the knowledge of my own existence. The other is, the second is the knowledge of God's existence. And the third is the knowledge of the existence of bodies. The sort of fourth is knowledge of existence of other finite spirits. I didn't get to talk about this at all, really, in the live lecture. Maybe I'll say something about it today, now or not. But Locke says this knowledge is sensible. So the bodies I know exist are the bodies that are subject of the qualities that I immediately sense. Again, those bodies might not have exactly the bulk, figure, etc. I think they do, but I know that it's a body that has this power. Because I know what the primary qualities are. All right, I won't say more about that now. But Locke says that this knowledge is demonstrative. I have a proof that God exists. And this knowledge is intuitive. And in fact, this intuitive knowledge forms the key step in the proof that God exists, or a key step. So just as in Descartes' meditations, Locke's proof of the existence of God involves a step that says, but I at least exist, and therefore, okay, so, right, this is one of the intuitive steps that allows us to complete the demonstrative proof that God exists. But in these cases, I mean, we certainly know that intuition and demonstration, by definition, are about agreement and disagreement of ideas. So this idea point view that there's an exception here is not really going to explain those, which are the most important ones, presumably. Locke also says that these are more certain than this, which is weird, but he also kind of says that these are more certain than this. So, that these are more certain than this, which is also kind of weird. All right. So how could we see that there actually is an agreement or disagreement of ideas here? So all of that I went into in much more detail than I did when I talked about it in the live lecture. Now I'm gonna, I hope, kind of skip over something I talked about at great length in the live lecture, which is that Locke does indeed think there's such thing as an idea of existence. So if you said, so it seems like you might say, so if I say white exists, the proposition that, or if I assent to the proposition that white exists, the proposition I'm assenting to is that the idea of white agrees with the idea of existence. Now, which mode of agreement would this have to be? Well, we're saying it's the fourth mode, but okay, let me not ask that because I just realized I'm not sure what to say about it. Could be important. Okay, but anyway, let's go. Let me go back to what I was going to say. So we want to say the idea of white agrees with the idea of existence. Well, the problem with that is that remember way back in chapter 2, this was chapter 2, book 2, chapter 7, section 7. Locke said that the ideas of unity and existence accompany all my ideas. So every time I get the idea of white, comes along with the idea of existence. Now, as far as knowledge goes, maybe that's not a problem because so when I know that white is there, you can say that what I know is that white and the idea of white, the idea of existence, the idea of white and the idea of existence now coexist. They're there together. And that tells me that the power to cause white exists. And you could say that that's what's special about perception, sense perception, as opposed to memory, or as opposed to all other mental operations, insofar as they're about simple ideas, that that every other time a simple idea comes, it doesn't come with the idea of existence. But wait, I thought you said all ideas come with the idea of existence. Well, it comes with the idea of existence modified by the consciousness that it existed before. Right? So Locke says This is book 4, chapter 11, section 11. As when our senses are actually employed about any object, we do know that it does exist, so by our memory we may be assured that heretofore things that affected our senses have existed. So, I mean, if we can really be certain that the mind cannot originate its own simple ideas, then you can understand that pretty well. Every time we have a memory, it comes along with the idea of past existence. Well, maybe I should say it the other way around. What does the certainty that the mind can't come up with its own simple ideas amount to? It amounts to this, that every time we have a simple idea, not with the idea of present existence. Well, every time we have a simple idea, it comes along either with the idea of present existence and external power, or it comes along with the idea of past existence and past external power. That is, starting to like this better. Okay, I mean, so maybe this could work, but we have to explain what the idea of, not just the idea of existence, but the idea of present, real existence has to be different from the idea of past existence. And also different from the idea of present ideal existence. That is, because as Locke says, whenever we have the idea, we're certain the idea exists, whatever that means. Okay, so I'm just kind of changing my mind about, or possibly changing my mind about this as I think. And so I've actually spent longer on this than I did in the live lecture. There may be some solution to what Locke is thinking of here, and maybe it can somehow be applied back to the case of knowledge of my own existence. And from there, if you understand what role that's supposed to play in the demonstration, also to the demonstrative knowledge of God's existence. I just want to say one more thing, because I did say it in the live lecture, which is another way of thought about how this should work. At least it seems like a different way. Maybe they really come to the same thing somehow, but here's the other way I've thought about how this could work. So, and I'm going to draw it horizontally rather than vertically. Well, actually, no, maybe that's not a good idea. I'm going to draw it horizontally. But I'm going to draw it like this. Here's the mind, right? So now I'm making it a circle like I did before. Everything up here is the mind. And here's the act of perception, or operation, I should say. And I'm going to call this particular operation of perception alpha. Alpha is in, oops. Oh, that's confusing. All right, let me start over. Yeah. Here's the mind. Here's the operation of perception. Alpha. The immediate object of this operation of perception is an idea, small a. And the idea small, by means of the idea small a, the perception has this external object, which is the quality. The quality A in some external body. Right, so like if this was a perception of white, its immediate alpha would be a perception of white, some particular perception of white. A would be the idea of white. But since this is a particular perception, it wouldn't be the abstract idea of white. It would be the idea of white still mixed with the circumstances of real existence, time, place, whatever. And by virtue and by way of that, the object might be the whiteness in this snowball, for example. All right, so that's the first operation, but now here's another operation of the same mind. So this is an operation of reflection. And I'm going to call it pi. And so an operation of reflection, remember, its immediate object is another operation of my own mind. So in this case, suppose its immediate object is this perception, alpha. So what that means is its immediate object, again, is an idea. Call that small p. By way of that, it refers to this perception, alpha. Now, suppose there's a visible necessary connection, like the connection between solidity and extension or whatever, between these two ideas. Now that is not completely unreasonable to suppose. After all, this is the idea of this particular perception, which is a perception of what? It's a perception of A. So you might think there's some way of just comparing the idea of a perception of A to the idea of A and seeing that they necessarily go together. So if that were true, then, and this is similar to what I said about the primary qualities a long time ago. So we have two different series of things which are analogous to each other. We have alpha, small a, and big A. And we have pi, small p, and alpha. Right? Because what fills the role of the quality that causes me to perceive the idea in the case of the act of reflection, pi, is this very operation of the mind, alpha. That's the quality. So these two series are analogous to each other. So we can write where is this written down? As p is to a, so pi is to alpha, and so alpha is to a. But now we said there's a visible necessary connection between P and A. Well, if there's a visible necessary connection between P and A, we know that P and A have to go together. Or I guess what we know specifically is that whenever there is P, there is A. Right? I don't always reflect on my acts of perception, but when I do, I do it using this idea or an idea like this, right? So therefore, we know that whenever there's alpha, there's pi. Or sorry, whenever there's pi, there's alpha. So in carrying out the reflection pi, I, so to speak, become immediately certain that this operation alpha is also there. And therefore also, of course, its subject, right? Because powers can't subsist by themselves, namely my mind. So this is an intuitive proof that I exist. In the sense that my mind exists. Doesn't prove that my body exists, of course. But remember that according to Locke, self is, well, I'm not going into that. All right. Anyway, it proves the thing that Descartes claims to prove in the second meditation, that my mind exists. And it looks like an intuitive proof. And also, it shows that when alpha exists, A exists. So that's why I can be certain that if I carry out this operation, the power to cause me to carry it out existed somewhere. Now that's nice, but that's also one of the problems with this solution, which is what makes me hope maybe now I'm thinking of a different one. Because remember, Locke says that this kind of knowledge, sensible knowledge, is not as certain as intuitive knowledge. This is supposed to be intuitive and this is supposed to be a little different, not as certain. Whereas according to this explanation, they should be the same. The other problem is that, again, what makes it so white is a simple idea. And according to Locke, in the part of book 2, the chapter of book 2, where he talks about ideas of reflection, perception, or I think he calls it sensation, there, sense perception is also a simple idea. So that this is not the idea of white in general, but rather the idea of the whiteness here in this snowball is due to the fact that that simple idea is not being considered abstractly as it is in its own bare, precise self, etc., but rather it's being mixed up with other ideas and or with the circumstances of real existence, such as place and time, and perhaps others, Locke said. So there's an idea of white here. So this idea A is a complex idea, or at least is a simple idea tied to some particular circumstances, if that's different from being a complex idea. And this idea P is also a simple idea, the idea of perception or sense perception or sensation. It's a simple idea, also connected to some real circumstances of existence. But of course, these real circumstances of existence are not the same as these, right? The operation here is not in the same place as the snowball. It is, I guess, at the same time, but it's not clear that that is going to be enough to connect this idea to this one. In fact, even if we added in place here, it's not clear how that would be enough to connect this one to this one, because this one contains this simple idea white that's different from all those circumstances. That's why I can abstract it out. And how are we going to get from this simple idea plus whatever circumstances to that simple idea? So I'm not sure this solution will work. I mean, it also calls into question what this operation is like. It seems like maybe in reflecting on my individual sense perceptions, I'm not getting anything about their content. I get their content only by having them. Okay, that's as much as I wanted to say about my own existence and the existence of bodies, both. Now let's see. Ooh, I've gone to almost 2 hours already. So I think I will just do what I did in the live lecture, which is rush in a couple comments about Locke's demonstration of the existence of God, and not talk, unfortunately, about the existence of other finite spirits. So in a way, it's not bad that I have to kind of rush through Locke's demonstration of the existence of God, because as with the other early modern philosophers, except Hume, well, I think just except Hume. Maybe Berkeley is different, actually. Well, okay, as with many other early modern philosophers, Locke's proof of the existence of God is one of the less original parts of his system, right? I mean, these people tend to produce variations of the traditional proofs of the existence of God, pre-modern proofs. In Locke's case, his proof is kind of a combination of a first mover type argument. Since there is motion now, bodies are in motion, and bodies can't give motion to themselves, and it can't be an infinite series. There must be something that's not a body that originally caused motion. It must always have existed. And another version of that is about the beginning of existence rather than motion. I guess really that's the first one he does. Those are kind of versions of what Kant calls the cosmological proof. Although they use other properties of the world besides its contingency to infer that there's a cause that's not the world. But anyway, from that, Locke reaches the conclusion that there's an infinitely powerful, eternal thing. Something is infinitely powerful. And again, according to Locke, infinitely powerful means, well, first of all, it has to be ultimately translated into time, space, or number. That's what our idea of into quantitative ideas. That's what our idea of the infinite immediately applies to. So it's going to mean something like the power to cause something to move infinitely far in a finite time, or something like that. But then, secondly, it's never a complete idea of infinity. It just means more than any limited idea I can come up with. So it just really means he's proved that something that has existed before any time I can think of and is more powerful than any power I can think of. That's what that's what he proves by this kind of quasi-cosmological proof, or like first mover argument. And then there's a second part, which is basically a variation of the argument from design, or what Kant calls the physico-theological proof. Argument from design. And this is a proof that says that because the world has certain special characteristics, we can conclude something about the cause of the world. I'm just wondering if I'm drawing the line between these two proofs in the right place in Locke. But anyway, never mind, since I'm out of time and more than out of time, I'll just say that right? And the way this works is that, or the conclusion Locke draws from this is that the first cause, or that, yeah, that this cause is not only eternal and infinitely powerful, but it's also absolutely simple and intelligent, right? That it's a mind, or I don't know if it says absolutely simple, really important. But anyway, that it's simple, meaning that the thing that's existed from all eternity and is infinitely powerful is not a bunch of things, it's one thing. Um, right, so there's one infinitely powerful, eternal cause of the world, and that cause is a mind or intelligence. Um, he doesn't here say exactly how we know that that cause is also good, which of course is the most important thing for Locke's moral philosophy. Um, you may think that that somehow follows from those other things. Uh, Hume, again, in a book that this year we're not reading in this course, although I have assigned it in some other years, uh, calls attention to the problems with any kind of deduction like that from um, the metaphysical perfections of God to the moral perfection. Okay, that's as far as I got in the live lecture, and so that is also where I will end this lecture. So I'm going to end this recording and also end